Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today's show is approaching the year anniversary of Russia's escalation in Ukraine, and we have special guest Congressman Don Bacon of the 2nd District of Nebraska as our guest today. He not only sits on the Agriculture and United States House of Representatives Armed Services Committee, but additionally, he is a decorated Air Force veteran. Congressman, first off, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Very good, Justin. Thanks for having me on.
So, Congressman, according to recent polls, there is a growing split among GOP voters over whether to continue supporting Ukraine. The poll I'm referring to is a Gallup poll in February that said 47% of GOP voters say we're doing too much. On the other hand, only 10% of Democratic voters said we're doing too much. Can you give us your best argument possible to these skeptical GOP voters on why supporting Ukraine is of vital interest to the United States?
You know, there was a letter out with about 10 Republicans right now out of 222 saying they want to stop support for Ukraine. So I just want to put it in perspective. We have 10 people on this letter out of 222. The majority of Republicans know we need to help Ukraine. Now, whether it should be exactly what they ask for or should we scrutinize it? I mean, there's some debate there. But I think it's in our national security interest to ensure that Ukraine remains independent. We just have to be candid. Putin is a dictator, thug. He's waging an unprovoked war. It's unjust. He's indeed conducting crimes against humanity, indiscriminate bombings of cities, going after people's infrastructure, their energy capabilities, the rape of Ukrainian women in the territories they hold. They're looting zoos. They're looting whatever the Ukrainians have. And the fact is, the goal here is to eliminate Ukraine as a nationality and make them really just part of Russia, because they don't see Ukrainians as an independent nation. They see Ukraine as part of Little Russia, is what they call the Ukrainians. The Russians themselves call themselves Big Russians. And so this is really a war against the national ethnicity, against the culture, and we got to stand up to it. Ukraine is 25% the size of Russia. This is might trying to make right just by the force that they have over Ukraine. And it's unacceptable. It's a violation of the rules order system that America has long stood for. So let's be honest. This is, if you want to look at real politic, Ukraine is mauling the Russian military with their personnel, their soldiers, their servicemen and women. And America is helping provide these quality weapons to help them do it. Roughly half of the Russian tanks have been destroyed. In a lot of ways, this has been in our national security interest to see Russians weakened. We don't want Russia to do this at all, but this is what they have brought on, and we cannot ignore it. We got to stand up to it.
Can you also touch on the message that it sends to the rest of the world if the Western alliance, led by folks like yourself and President Biden, bipartisanship coalition, ultimately lets Russia take the territory they want and get a settlement that is favorable to them? And specifically the message that it sends to authoritarians with nuclear weapons, but also countries like Iran, our enemies who may want to go and get nuclear weapons. Is there a concern that without standing tough, we are now inviting countries to pursue these horrible crimes?
You know, the rules-based order has served the world well. It's served America well. And that's what I mean by rules-based order. We recognize people's sovereignty. We recognize rule of law. And what Putin has done is just throwing that out the window and saying, I'm stronger than this neighbor. And what are you going to do to stop me? And if this becomes the rule, our world is going to be a much more dangerous place. And in the end, America itself will be threatened and jeopardized. And so I think we have to stand up for the smaller country, try to give them the weapons that they need so they can survive. And if Putin somehow still prevails, we all know what it's like to live on a high school playground or junior high playground when the bully is not stopped. The bullies never stop, unless somebody stands up to them. And I think we should do it early rather than later. We know what happened in 1938 and 39 when we didn't stand up to Germany or Japan to the level that we should have. And they did not stop until they had to be defeated by force. And we don't want to see this happen with Russia. We would rather stand up to Russia now. Hopefully they learn a valuable lesson and put themselves back in the rules-based order.
So you mentioned that there's near unanimous support in the Republican Party, but not totally unanimous. We have very loud voices, right? Not saying they're powerful within the legislating process, but Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and there's so many more that are anti-Ukraine, to put it very nicely. We have an election approaching. A presidential one means everything is out the table. It's difficult to predict things. President Trump is running. He's an anti-Ukraine voice as well. So under this situation, the question is simple. Will you guarantee that you will do everything within your power to continue supporting Ukraine? And that means even if Speaker McCarthy is not able to advance Ukraine aid on the House floor because of the dynamics within your caucus, would you be willing to work with Democrats, your friends on the Republican side of the aisle, to 100% tell the Ukrainians listening to this show that no matter what, they're going to get aid that they need?
So, by the way, both sides have a very small minority that I think are hostile to Ukrainian aid. And by the way, if anybody that tries to, echo Putin and his propaganda, that is not a conservative message. I surely don't see that as a Republican message. And I think we should clearly stand against it. But I would counter with this. I am going to advocate for aid for Ukraine. And I think the far majority of the Republicans in Congress are going to do that. But will it be exactly what Ukraine asked for or exactly what Biden asked for? I do think there's going to be this discussion to have a justification. Do we need 100 harpoons? Do we need 200 harpoons? Do we need ATACMs or not ATACMs? Do we need to have F-16s? I think it's an all right discussion. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the administration is going to get 100% of what it asked for. There's going to be a dialogue of justifying what is there. But in the end, I will definitely advocate for military aid to Ukraine, and that we want to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to win this war against Russia. So I do think there's a reasonable debate or discussion that should be had. What is that, and what can we best provide? Ukraine. I'll give you an example. I've been in the middle of these discussions. Do we provide F-16s or not to Ukraine? Now the administration is saying no. Right. So here's an example where you can maybe be no. It doesn't mean you're anti-Ukraine, would be my whole point. So let's have these discussions on an individual basis on weapon systems and the level that's needed. We also need to have what is the rest of the world providing Ukraine so that we can go back to our constituents and say, hey, the British are doing this, French are doing this, Germans are doing this, and so forth. And the administration has promised me, I've talked to them personally about it, that they will provide this. I think that helps us with this overall discussion. But to answer your question directly, yes, I'm going to support aid to Ukraine.
Okay. No holds barred. Doesn't matter the political realities.
When you say no holds barred, it doesn't mean the administration gets 100% of what they ask or Ukraine. We have this discussion, but I will support military aid for Ukraine. It's in our national security interest that Ukraine remains independent.
When we're discussing potential aid to Ukraine and specific military hardware, which is right in your wheelhouse, being a decorated Air Force guy who's been in theater, you've been in the Pentagon, so you've seen this from multiple perspectives. What are the inputs of the arguments that we're looking at? So for planes, what are the pros and cons when you say we'll have a honest look at what is being debated?
Well, I've been sort of undecided on the F-16s because the administration has opposed it. And they bring in some valuable information that the Russians have very intricate, sophisticated air defense capabilities. If they use precision targeting, will the F-16s be vulnerable at the bases? I think that's been a valuable discussion. In the end, I have decided to support F-16 deliveries to Ukraine. But my point is, it's worthy to have that dialogue. And I guess my point would be, we're just not going to do a blank check. Let's have the discussion. What makes sense? Was an early proponent for ATACMs because Russians are able to target Kyiv and the most deepest cities in Ukraine with cruise missiles and various other kinds of ballistic missiles. And it's been very hard to stop. We've been sending some sophisticated air defenses there, but some of these weapon systems are hard to shoot down. And I believe Ukraine needs to have some capabilities to counter, to go also strike deep outside of Ukrainian territory. I see it as more of a deterrence to Russia. Russia, if you keep hitting Kyiv, well, you shouldn't just be able to do that, one way. The Ukrainians need to have some counterpunch capabilities. I want to be able to give Ukraine the ability to punch back if needed. But these are discussions that we need to have in this debate out there. I would also, as I roll back to last year, December, before the invasion, I wanted long-range air defenses to be sent. I wanted Harpoon missiles that could hit Russian shipping out in the Black Sea. I also thought there needed to be more long-range strike capabilities like the ATACMS. I was told by the administration, no, that would be provocative. And then once the invasion occurred, it really took 2 or 3 months before the administration got to the point where they were doing Harpoons and the longer-range air defenses. They've never even got to the ATACMS as of yet. But I think we've been slow on some of these more advanced capabilities that I thought would have helped out Ukraine early. I think the administration has gotten to where they need to be, but typically 2 or 3 months late on this. And so we're a democracy. We're a republic. We're going to have these debates, and that's just part of the system that we have. In the end, I'm going to advocate for what I think Ukraine needs and what we can afford. But also, we have to have an eye on what do we have in our supply lines, because at some point we also have to be prepared to help Taiwan. And it's better to help Taiwan before an invasion than after an invasion.
Congressman, you just mentioned a common criticism that we've heard from the left and right on our show, whether it be members of Congress, think tanks, that the arms delivery to Ukraine has, in fact, been slow. Can you help us understand this? Is this the political calculations happening within the White House? Is this the reality on the ground, diplomatically speaking? Because you mentioned we need to present a united front to your constituents. Or is this just the logistical realities on the ground, that it's probably difficult to get M1 Abrams into a war zone without, potentially provoking Russia?
Well, it depends on the weapon system. With the M1s, a little tougher, so they're a little harder logistics. But I think the administration did right by sending some, because that gave the green light for the Leopard tanks and Centurion tanks and other tanks to eventually be sent to Ukraine. Early on, the administration was dragging its feet on sending advanced weapons. They were doing the Javelin anti-tank missiles and more small arms type capabilities that they were given to Ukraine. In December, prior to invasion, in classified settings, but then unclassified settings, so I can say it now, I advocated for Harpoons. I advocated for double-digit surface-to-air missiles that were Russian-made that we had access to. And the administration said no, because they didn't want to provoke Russia. And to me, we were also hearing that the Russians had already given the order that they were going to invade Ukraine. But we were dragging our feet because we didn't want to provoke them. And I didn't like it. I thought a lot of this stems from Mr. Sullivan, and I think a hesitancy, over conservative hand-wringing kind of going on. But I would say they eventually got there. They got there around April after the invasion, where they said, okay, let's start studying these capabilities. And part of it is I think they thought Ukraine was going to fold relatively quickly as well. And once Ukraine showed they had the ability to push back and actually prevail against Russia, push them out of Kyiv, I think that probably bolstered the administration's advocates for weapons, and they ended up winning the day. So, one, they were afraid to provoke Russia. Two, they thought Ukraine was going to fall pretty quickly. So once Ukraine disproved that, you see the administration came forward. And then in some cases, like you're saying, it's more of a supply chain and logistics capability. So there's a little bit of combinations here. I think the administration has been slow more often than not, but eventually gets to the right spot.
This is a very dark way of thinking. Zelensky himself is a very dark force. That is obvious if you watch him. It is unmistakable. Who could not see that? This man is a destroyer. He banned a Christian faith in his country and arrested nuns and priests. Oh, but he's a hero, claim our leaders, from Chuck Schumer to Mitch McConnell. No, Zelensky is not a hero. He is an instrument of total destruction. That is not a defense of his enemies. It's just true. And maybe that's why Joe Biden is drawn to him.
You mentioned that one of the, I don't know if this is the right term, excuses the administration was using for dragging its feet were fears of escalation. We also hear this as a Russian talking point, whether in Putin's speech about, nuclear power or on Tucker Carlson's show about nuclear war. There is concern bubbling up with certain sectors of the U.S. public about a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States. Obviously, Congressman, we support on this show robust arms provisions and financial aid to Ukraine because we agree with you on the seriousness of the threat. That being said, you're a military guy, you have oversight of the DoD. Can you help us understand how we should view escalation threats? What prism should we use? Because right now, currently, according to reports, not classified intelligence or anything, we are providing tanks, which is known, but also we're providing intelligence and technology support to go directly kill Russians. So is this escalation issue kind of malarkey that's being overblown, or is this something that we actually need to focus on and be wary of when we're deciding what weapon systems are appropriate?
Well, we can't pretend to know what's in Putin's head. Putin, he's an independent actor. I think he's unstable. I think he's cornered right now, so he's a little bit unpredictable. I mean, he came in and thought he was going to win in Ukraine in a couple of weeks. In fact, we thought the same. And he's been getting his butt kicked, right? I mean, about half the tanks of his vaunted this army that has this great history have been destroyed. And the Ukrainians have been outfighting the Russians on the battlefield with a 4-1 disadvantage, right? And so there's some pride and ego there. I think if we keep American forces out of Ukraine, to me, that is a line that you could say is escalatory. And I would say that we would be directly involved in the conflict at that point. But providing the weapons that Ukraine needs and the training and the intelligence, I believe that's below the threshold that would trigger the Russians. But we really don't know. To be candid with you, it's hard to read Putin's mind. He's, like, again, I say he's an unstable actor. But what we do need to have is the strength outside of Ukraine and NATO as a further deterrence to what Putin's doing. So having our U.S. armored divisions and brigades and air defenses, air forces in NATO near the periphery, like in the Baltics, Poland, that serves as a further deterrence for escalation. And then America's nuclear deterrence needs to always be clear and 100%, where you can't confuse that we have the capabilities for a second strike capabilities. So we got to make sure that our deterrence outside of Ukraine is credible and it can't be second guessed. And that will add to what this discussion that you bring up.
So you're also an expert on NATO from your past before Congress and now, again, the committee you serve on. As a whole, how would you view NATO's response to Russia's invasion? And did anything surprise you with how NATO has acted? Thankfully,
outside of Hungary right now and maybe Turkey, there's been a unified response, and I appreciate that. And I love the fact that Sweden and Finland, wanted to join, and I've worked with both in various capacities. Recently visited Finland, and I know they wanted to be part of NATO, and I'm honored to have Sweden also want to be part of our team. I think the NATO, by and large, has done well. It's been uneven. The British have stood up in a significant way. The Poles have done a great job. The Baltics have really led the way, though they're small in number. When you look at their GDP contributions, it's exceeded almost anybody else in NATO. But I do think some of the Western European countries could maybe do more. And I think Germany was slow. But if you look at some of their more recent contributions, they've really picked it up. So I think in general, the NATO countries have done a good job. Well, I say excellent. Maybe I won't go that far, but they've done a good job. It's been some unevenness, but particularly Eastern Europe has really stood tall, and the British, and I think we've had good partners. By the way, I'm a strong NATO advocate. Wherever America has gone since World War II, NATO countries have been by our side, even in the Middle East, and we forget that. We couldn't have done operations in Africa or the Middle East without the two great air bases that we have in Germany. And so even when Germany's, GDP production for military hasn't been up to what we want, they've given us access to bases that has made a tremendous difference to our capabilities. So NATO's been a very important part of our strategic framework.
I think that this applies to a lot of NATO countries as well as our own. We've seen largely unnamed reports, right, across all different types of media, Fox News, New York Times, saying that defense officials are concerned that we may be running out of certain munitions. And you mentioned this, that we need to have robust supply lines in case something happens to Taiwan, or we want to start providing Taiwan with munitions. And I think the artillery numbers are Ukraine shooting off like 100,000 a month. And that was far exceeding what our initial estimates of a conflict between Ukraine and Russia would look like. So the question is twofold. Are these concerns real? And if they are real, is there anything that you in Congress can do to help alleviate this, or the administration through the Defense Production Act or something like that? Can we address it?
It's multiple fold again. Right now, we don't produce Stingers. And Stingers have been very effective in this fight. Javelins have been discontinued. We've stopped making ATACMs, believe it or not, right? So there's going to be a debate. Do you have to restart these lines, or maybe you haven't upgraded capabilities of the Stinger and the Javelin? But so some of our production lines have stopped. We don't have the depth in our production lines that we need. And I believe this will be a priority in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, that we're going to have to invest in our production capacity. It's all right to have storage. And we've had people in our military saying excess storage and supply is not efficient. Well, no, you want to have a lot of supply of weapons. And so I think we should go back and review that thinking. We need to have, it's all right to have a lot of storage of weapons, and we could see where we need them in this case. So yes, we have a problem. We don't have a production capacity that's keeping up with the Ukrainian output. Now, it's interesting to look at this. The Americans have always had more of a precision targeting. We've gone that way since World War II over time, since we've had more precision capabilities. The Ukrainians had a little more of a mass effect, because that's their lessons as being part of the Soviet Union back in the day. We're trying to get them to be more, take our coordinates, do precision targeting versus the barrage firing. But that just takes time. There's cultures that we have. And so hopefully it's a little bit of, they are shooting more than we can produce, but we got to boost up our production lines. And you brought up Taiwan. We have a $19 billion backlog right now to Taiwan that they've already purchased, but we don't have the weapons to send there yet. We need to fix that. A day one of a war with Taiwan's a day too late. The more we give to Taiwan now, I'm thinking, again, harpoon missiles, sea mines to help block an amphibious attack, air defenses. These kind of capabilities in Taiwan will deter potential Chinese invasion. And that's what we want. We don't want war in Taiwan. But if we can deter it, that's the best option.
And I went years ago now, unfortunately, I'm getting older. I went over to Taiwan on a congressional delegation trip, and I've never, even in America, maybe it's right up there with freedom-loving people. It's a free society that is in the face of China, and they are very much united and only getting more united against a potential Chinese invasion, whether it be through hard military or some type of economic coercion of their business elites.
Hong Kong showed the Taiwanese that China's, this thing about one China, two systems, it's a lie. And they see it. If they become part of China's political control, the Taiwanese will lose their freedoms. They'll lose their free market economy. They'll lose their freedoms of press, freedom of religion, and so forth. And they see the reality. And, I find it interesting. I love studying foreign policy and history. It's a hobby. Russia and China both have foreign policy things that they're doing right now that undermines their foreign policy goals. So Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO, doesn't want Ukraine to be part of EU. But by invading Ukraine, what do? They've pushed Ukraine to make them very strong pro-West. They have strengthened all the countries on the periphery of Russia to see Russia as a threat and want to align more with us. Very counterproductive, right? They're undermining their own strategic interests. China's doing the same thing by their genocide of Uyghurs, by how they treat the people in Hong Kong, by their treatment of the border with India. They're actually creating all the border countries saying, hey, China's a threat. And so I find it interesting, both countries' foreign policy actions are undermining their foreign policy goals.
We've seen already over these past months the provision of non-lethal assistance that does go directly to aiding and abetting Russia's war effort, and some further information that we are sharing today and that I think will be out there soon that indicates that they are strongly considering providing lethal assistance to Russia.
If there are any thoughts and efforts by the Chinese and others to provide lethal support to the Russians in their brutal attack against Ukraine, that is unacceptable. Again, that would be a red line.
We should designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, because if you do that under U.S. law and China provides lethal weapons, they will get sanctioned. And to the Chinese, if you jump on the Putin train now, you're dumber than dirt. The most catastrophic thing that could happen to U.S.-China relationship, in my opinion, is for China to give lethal weapons to Putin.
This leads us to the next part of the discussion, Congressman. You just mentioned $19 billion in pre-orders for Taiwan. There is criticism that the United States focusing again on Europe as we pivoted away to the Middle East, as we're now trying to pivot to Asia, is preventing us from actually focusing on China. You're in conversations with DoD and in classified settings. Without giving anything away, what do you make of these criticisms? Can we not walk and chew gum at the same time?
We have to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're not doing a very good job of it. And we tend to, look at the shiny coin right in front of us and forget there's other interests and priorities that we have. So I believe America is the indispensable nation when it comes to defending freedom, rallying our allies for a concerted goal and effort, but we can't do it by ourselves. So we're going to have to robust our supply lines and our defense production, and so we can help out both Europe and Taiwan at the same time. But Europe is going to have to help out. Japan's going to have to help out. Australia is going to have to help out. That's the only way we're going to be able to work both theaters simultaneously. And we're going to have to work closely with our allies. Free nations going to have to work together against China, that's got 90% of our GDP and climbing, and Russia, that's doing an active war right now, and that has a nuclear inventory that matches ours and is more modernized.
I don't know if these reports are accurate or not. Again, we're pivoting back to Mr. Sullivan, but he is concerned that China is about to cross a line and provide lethal aid to Russia. So is this a real concern? Is this media posturing? And if it does happen, what response should the administration have?
Well, this has happened since I've been home, so I will take the administration at its word on this, and hopefully we can validate when I get back to D.C. Russia's desperate. China doesn't want to see America prevail. When we prevail, it undermines their national security interests. I find it interesting, because China and Russia do not have a long-term affection towards each other. There's deep-seated frictions that go back, and I don't think those will be easily overcome. But in the end, we're seen as the near-term threat for both, because we like freedom, we support equality, we support sovereignty of the people. They're autocracies or authoritarian regimes, and so everything we stand for counters both of their countries right at the moment. I believe China is going to be aiding Russia because they see it as in their national security interest. And I believe we need to put a bright light on what China really is. China has undermined the freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. They have 1 million Uyghurs in forced labor camps today. They're doing forced sterilizations on Uyghur women. We gotta call them out for what they are. They're taking away the freedoms of their people. It's an authoritarian regime. They're helping out other authoritarian regimes. And the more that we can, when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, a lot of the intellectuals in our country thought, what a terrible mistake. What does he know? But it was profound in the Soviet Union because we called them what they really were, and it wounded them. And the dissidents of the Soviet Union were the most overjoyed. Well, we need to do the same thing with China right now, I believe. What they're doing is To think they have a million Uyghurs in forced labor camps because of their religion, we need to call that out for what it is.
We actually hosted, unfortunately, a victim of a forced sterilization in a Uyghur camp. She's, I believe, now in Canada. It's genocide, right? It's state-sponsored genocide. So we empathize with you completely. And switching gears a little bit, bringing it back to me personally, you're now in charge of a special select committee on military quality of life. And that matters a lot to me because my dad fought in Vietnam and the quality of life in the military was not that great back then. Comes home, with PTSD, and then we have to fight with the VA to get the support. Can you just get into what your role is going to be and how we can improve the quality of life for the brave citizens of this country that fight and put their lives on the line for the rest of us?
Right now, we're taking our inputs for this coming National Defense Authorization Act bill, which we want to wrap up in June. When Chairman Rogers thinks he has enough data to get this bill largely boxed up and a bow on it, they're going to activate our panel, and we're going to be bipartisan. This is going to be about as bipartisan of a team that you're going to see. What first interested me in this and why I proposed something similar to Chairman Rogers is when I was on the Ag Committee, we were getting reports of junior enlisted on SNAP or food stamps. And, when a young E1 or E2 or E3, whatever it may be, and they get married, it's one thing if the spouse is working, but if they end up having a family with kids, they fall below the poverty line pretty quickly. And so then you're forcing these people out to get better paying jobs, or they're on SNAP and their quality of life is not good. And so this is what inspired me to propose to Chair Rogers that we got to tackle this. So our junior enlisted pay or mid-level pay needs to be looked at because we know that these people qualify for food assistance. And it's not right for when people are serving our country. So we're going to take this on first thing and come up with some proposals on how to fix. Then we're going to look at housing because we have cut housing allowance, which over time has meant that we've not invested in the base housing and it's fallen behind. We want to look at the healthcare. We've hollowed out a lot of our healthcare through co-pays and a variety of other things. So we want to look at that. We want to look at like daycare. There's a long time daycare waiting list. So we want to look at that as well. And I also want to focus on spouse employment. We think that we can make agreements, for example, with the local chambers of commerce and involve them more in hiring spouses for those spouses when they arrive at a new base. I know I moved my wife 16 times over 30 years in the Air Force. She had a very hard time getting her feet on the ground because I was moving every 2 years, roughly. And we think we could do more to help facilitate spouse employment, and not necessarily through maybe government programs, but through partnerships with the local community. But these are the things that we'll be looking at, and hopefully we'll get them in place by 2020, in place for the 2025 NDAA or a year from this June.
That's quick. A lot of the time, these committees don't have any impact. So it's nice to see that it's probably going to have a real world impact on something that is so vitally important.
I'm excited too. We have Republicans and Democrats from all spectrums wanting to be on this. They want to be on something that will have value and impact. And I don't really see where we're going to have 1 ounce or 1% of partisanship in this. I mean, this is going to be an American patriots serving American patriots. And we don't care left or right, what's your party on this. It's going to be a team effort.
Is there anyone switching a little bit, is there anyone on the other side of the aisle, so a Democrat on the Armed Services Committee that you work the best with?
I work with a bunch. One of my best friends in the House is Salud Carbajal from California. We probably were brothers in a different life and didn't know it, but we get along real well. And Jared Golden, I work very well with. Chrissy Houlihan, I really go on and on. Even with some where I would say maybe I disagree on nuclear deterrence, but we agree in other areas. I have found that there's very few areas of partisanship on the HASC. There is some with the nuclear triad and how robust do you need to have it. We have a little bit there, though I would say even then 2/3 of the Democrats agree with the Republicans on it. So it's still pretty bipartisan. Some of our personnel issues can be there, whether it comes to I'll call it some of the woke debates that we have. But you take that aside, this committee, I would say, is 95% bipartisan.
I think it's really sad that the woke stuff even is mentioned with our military. I think we've seen how well Russia's military is doing in their quote unquote anti-woke. So that's just the comment that I'll leave there.
We tend to say there's 100% or a 0% on these. And I would say there's enough there that it's all right to have it reviewed, but I would just say it often gets over-reported and exaggerated. I mean, like we had this one thing come out of the Air Force Academy. It wasn't the Air Force Academy, it was a cadet. But then the whole Air Force Academy gets labeled with that one cadet puts out. My point is the reporting sometimes gets sensationalized and out there, but it's, we have a system that allows us to review and we can do some course corrections. But I'm sort of with you. This isn't 100 or a 0. I do think it's manageable, easily manageable if we do this right. One thing that we do need, and I see the data on polling and evidence in our own district, our leadership, to include our president, we just got to make sure that we communicate to middle America that we live in this great country, greatest country in the world, and that we're going to have the meanest, toughest, most ass-kicking military in the world. That's what draws recruitment in. And sometimes we're not getting that message out to the areas that would normally recruit in the military. So I think a little bit of better strategic messaging would help. It would be my advice to our executive branch.
Yeah, we don't want a lot of puppy dogs and kittens out there, right? We want mean SOBs like yourself when it's appropriate.
I'm not saying and I think we have a military that is that, but that's not what's being communicated in some areas of our country. I hear it. And so they need to know. So we just got to do a better job saying that we're going to be the meanest SOBs out there with our military. We're going to have a force that is, the strongest of all, and nobody will be able to stand up to the U.S. military. I mean, like the U.S. Marine motto of a few, the proud, the Marines, that is such a good story that attracts people that have that character in them, right? And we just got to make sure we're touching those chords in people's hearts right now, because I think we're missing it a little bit.
Yeah, and there's an opportunity too with the world events that we're seeing, especially just war being fought in Ukraine. So I want to, for the last 5-8 minutes or so, switch to the political. So I remember a story in 2016 before I switched to the RNC to ultimately help President Trump get elected. I was in LA for a Kansas congressman, and we got into a huge debate, Congressman Bacon, on when and who he should endorse, right? It was down to basically Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. I was telling the guy, endorse Trump, he's going to win, he's going to go big in your district. And he ultimately endorsed Ted Cruz because he was also a House Freedom Caucus member, a Tea Party guy. Unreasonable. I love Congressman Huelskamp, but we didn't always agree to eye to eye.
From Kansas.
So that leads me to my question to you. When you're determining how to endorse a candidate for governor or a candidate for president or even senator, so a statewide race, how much of that is based on the candidate aligning with your policy views, the candidate being the best option that's electable, and honestly, how much of it is based on who can you endorse that will help you politically with your voters?
Well, that's a really good question. And obviously, I debate my own mind this as well. First of all, I look for our values. I mean, I think values are most important. I am a conservative. I believe in the free market system. I believe in free trade. I believe in peace through strength. I am pro-life. I believe in all of our Bill of Rights and our freedoms and defense of them. And I want to look at someone who has those values. I also think you got to look at temperament and comportment. We want to elect people who are respectful, who want to grow the tent. You win elections by adding, not subtracting. And so you want to grow the tent of our party. And even if they're on the other party, we shouldn't be seeing each other as enemies. And we're missing that right now in our nation's dialogue. So there's values. I believe there's the comportment and temperament a part of that. And I think ultimately too, you want to look at who can win. So I think there's all these variables are important. I think what's hurt us in the last 3 election cycles is the perception of the temperament and comportment part of our party. I think those who were more reasonable, I would say the decency factor, we did pretty well this last election cycle. Those who were perceived to be on the extreme side or out of the comportment acceptability didn't do that well. And so I think that should be a lesson internally to our own party. And again, we got to be able to reach in the middle and win the middle. I mean, it's one thing to win rural areas like Western Texas, and I love Western Texas. I'm not bashing them. Western Nebraska, I love Western Nebraska, but these areas come in at 65-35 fours. But if you want to win the presidency, if you want to win the Senate, you got to win in suburban and middle America, and that is up for grabs right now. And the conservative values work in middle America, suburban America, but comportment and temperament is also equally as required. And we got to ensure that we have a candidates or the top candidate that has that. If you want to win the White House, if you want to win the Senate, if you want to win a big majority in the U.S. House.
So not asking for an endorsement, but if you could have a magic wand and say, okay, this candidate for president would be perfect based on everything that I just said. Do any names come to mind?
I think we have quite a few. I was just down in Florida, and I think it's impressive that, Governor DeSantis won an amazing reelection, record numbers for reelection. That says something to me, that he was able to win independent and moderate voters. And then I look at Nikki Haley. I think she is a successful two-termer that has also got foreign policy street credibility as well, and I admire what she has done. I'm personal friends with Mike Pence. I know his character, though I think he'll be a hit from both sides of coming out of the Trump administration on that. But I know him as a person; he's a very good man. I love Tim Scott. I love listening to him speak. I love his story. I think we have a lot of good folks that can compete well, that won't only have the values that we're looking for, but they can reach in the middle and help us win a majority for the president and help us win the Senate and hold the House.
You should also reach out to Chris Sununu. I'm from New Hampshire, so I'm a little biased.
I don't know him as well, but I've always admired what he's done, and he's been successful. And so we're looking. Can someone win an election and win a re-election? And he has shown that.
I just don't understand why we're a country that pays people who could go to work not to. And when I
how big a deal is that?
Look,
does that come away with the emergency measures coming off, or is it deeper?
Oh, considerably deeper.
Okay.
And by the way, it pays you on both sides of the ledger, right? If you impose work requirements on all means-tested entitlement programs for working-age people, not for the disabled, not for seniors, but for working-age people, it's $1 trillion in savings during the 10-year budget window.
This is in Medicaid and other.
This is in Medicaid and in food stamps.
In food stamps, sure. It's discretionary spending.
Yeah, those are the biggest. The biggest chunks are from the Obamacare Medicaid expansion to able-bodied adults and to
Social Security and
it's over 400
Social Security and Medicare are off the table. But you're saying you're taking Medicaid and other aspects of discretionary spending.
If it was Matt Gaetz, I think that we do need reforms to Social Security and Medicare. I understand politically enough people.
But that can come later.
That's not going to happen now.
Right.
Medicaid.
And you don't need to have.
By the way, Medicaid should not be a sacred cow.
Big time.
And so, but it hasn't been. You notice people don't talk about Medicaid.
No, it's always Medicare and Social Security, right?
Right. So with Medicaid, I think there's a lot of meat on the bone for savings. In SNAP, you can get over $400 billion in savings.
We have a fight over the debt limit. You've actually been in the center of it in the media, at least. People are running to you. Maybe they're asking honest questions. Maybe they're trying to gin up controversy within your party. Neither here nor there. Right now, publicly, we basically have two proposals. The original Rick Scott, which was sunset every single piece of federal legislation every 5 years, which would potentially cut Medicare, Social Security. He has since revised it. We also have the Russ Vought proposal, which was promoted before it came out by folks like Matt Gaetz on Steve Bannon's podcast or whatever that swell is. And it's really simple. They want to cut Medicaid and SNAP, which we previously discussed on some programs for lower income Americans, to balance the budget. Do either of these proposals speak to you? And do we even have any idea of where potential cuts would come from in the coming negotiations?
they were saying we need work requirements in the SNAP. We have work requirements in the SNAP program. They were put back in by the Senate in a previous election cycle. So in other words, some of these things, like let's add back work requirements to SNAP. We have work requirements in SNAP, and I could guarantee you that. So there's, I think, some misinformation out there. Both proposals, with what you're saying, we just got to be honest. They're not going to pass the Senate for sure, probably not even out of the House, but they're not going to get through the Senate, nor signed by the president. And therefore, they wouldn't have a veto override capability. So we're just going to be reasonable. It's all right to have some proposals, but we also got to know what can pass the Senate and what the president can sign. And that's going to take negotiation to get this done. Now, the president's position, he's not going to negotiate, that's a non-starter. He himself has opposed 3 different clean debt ceiling raises himself. So when he says you got to do this, well, he opposed it 3 different times in his own right. And he did it when the president was in a different party and he didn't agree with that president's priorities. Same situation we're in right now on our side. But we're not also get these, I would say, pie in the sky things that some of our folks want. They can't get out of the House, let alone the Senate, let alone by the president. So we're going to have to find a realistic area that we're going to negotiate. And I believe it's going to look something like we're going to keep discretionary spending, which, by the way, is only 30% of our spending. You cannot balance the budget. Even if you cut all discretionary dollars, which means half of which is defense, that doesn't even balance the budget. So a lot of our folks want to focus on discretionary spending that won't even get you to first base of what we need to do, right? We have more revenue coming in on our discretionary spending than we're spending. So this is an area that tends to, we get more sighted in, but it's not going to solve the problem. But I think we can keep discretionary spending within inflation, under inflation, as a left and right spending caps, if you will. And I think there would be, I think this is an area we can negotiate. It's fertile ground. We've got to be candid too. Republicans will not be able to solve the mandatory spending challenges on our own. Mandatory spending alone is going to give us a $19 trillion deficit over the next 10 years. And this is going to have to be something we work with Democrats to come up with some bipartisan agreement to get our arms around. By the way, the Democrats can't solve this on their own either. They want to just tax their way out of that. That's not going to happen. You can't tax your way out of this either. So I propose a bipartisan committee or commission, some kind of structure that puts people together that wants to solve this problem and find some middle ground where both sides are going to win some and lose some to get our mandatory spending in a spot that we can live with in our country. Right now, we're spiraling out of control and nobody wants to take their foot off the gas, right? And we're going to have to find a way to do it.
Just to make your point a little bit more clearly, the last time there was a debt limit negotiation, my understanding, you probably know more, was when Speaker Pelosi didn't want to raise the debt limit when President Trump was in office unless we increased the budget caps. So it is something done by both parties. It's just some of the media don't like to acknowledge that or are not aware of it.
You should have heard him when I said President Biden. We got him on tape opposing clean budget or debt ceilings.
I mean, I hope so. You have 60 years of opposition research to go through.
But then they come back and say, Don, you voted for debt. I mean, my point being is we have divided government. We're going to have to be honest. We're going to have to find some common ground in the middle, and we're both going to win some and lose some on this. And if you think you're going to get 100%, no, you're smoking something, right? Or if you're going to get 0%, that's not right either. You're not a good negotiator. There's somewhere in the middle that we're going to be.
So, real last question here. So, are we going to get this resolved before Standard & Poor's downgrades us like happened in 2010, 2011? Or are we going to be so irresponsible as the White House and President Biden and Speaker McCarthy and Senator Schumer, where Congress is going to let this fester until the last minute and hurt hundreds of millions of Americans?
I believe if we keep spending within inflation and have a commitment of some type, some kind of structure that allows us to do a focused teamwork on the mandatory spending, I think we can get that agreement. It won't be all the Republicans. It may not be all the Democrats. But I think the 80% on both sides of the middle will largely support that. But there's going to have to be give and take on both sides. It won't be as much as perhaps the Freedom Caucus wants. And it surely won't be as much as the progressive Democrats want on their side. It surely won't be what Joe Biden says, zero concessions. But I believe we can if there's some honest give and take on both sides. You'll get the middle on both sides supporting that.
Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you the best the rest of the week.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.